This episode is dedicated to my dear friend Billy Britton, who somehow thought what I had to say was worth listening to. Thanks for your trust, Billy, and Godspeed. The American West and ultimately the American nation was built upon the backs of hard-working men and women. These were people who risked everything in search of the promise of better times ahead. They were visionary, optimistic, entrepreneurial risk-takers. Many left established homes and successful professions and risked everything in search of something more. Others had nothing to lose and went west strictly on the promise of better times. Now, America needed those people, men, women, all ethnicities, all religions, all backgrounds. America needed their courage, their optimism, their vision, their perseverance, their bone, muscle, and sweat, as well as their intellect. And America needed something else to grow into what it eventually became. It needed blood and leather. Welcome to episode 3 of the Blood and Leather podcast. Well, hello, folks. I'm Tim Carter, the creator, producer, writer, and host of the Blood and Leather podcast. And this podcast is really my attempt to share my love for my favorite times, my favorite people, and the events from the history of the United States, virtually to anyone who might be interested. Now, I know that everybody has different perspectives and different interests, so perhaps this podcast is not for everyone. But if you're interested in learning something that you might not have known, maybe stick around and give it a chance. From my perspective, history is one long, unending story. And as the story unfolds, as we dig in and learn more, well, there are ever more connections, more things to learn, and more things to share. In my last episode, episode 2, The Birth of the Fur Trade, I told the story of the birth of Quebec and the evolution of the fur trade when Montreal was the center for that industry. We recapped some of the major characters in that evolution and ended with the founding of the city of St. Louis and what would become the state of Missouri. But if you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you now to go back and check it out. It's a great way to kind of set the stage for this episode, which is going to focus on the trappers and mountain men in the Rocky Mountains of the western United States. This episode is going to be based largely upon the book A Life Wild and Perilous by Robert Utley, although many other sources are going to be a part of the story. I could just as easily choose at least a dozen other books to use as a basis, but this is one I own, which provides kind of a nice overview, and almost all the characters we meet here will be included in other episodes in the future. So some are going to be the focus of a future episode entirely, and we're going to get to those in due time. Now, I can't wait to dig in on this, so let's get started. Now, episode 3 was supposed to be entitled Trappers and Mountain Men, but I am not happy with that title at this point after working on the episode, and I've decided instead to call it The First Mountain Man, and that will become, the reason for that will become obvious as we dig into the episode. When I first thought about creating a history podcast, this period and these men were foremost in my thinking. You see, I've been fascinated with Jim Bridger and John Colter, Jedediah Smith, Kit Carson, and a lot of other characters from that time frame. But what I always find is you never really know a topic until you study it and you try to boil it down to the key, most interesting, and most relevant points, and try to tell those in a story in a way that might keep someone interested. That's harder than it sounds, especially in today's attention span shortened, TikTok influenced culture. People don't spend much time settling in and really listening. When you couple that with my own blinders, after all, I am interested, so my judgment about what is interesting may not be entirely reliable. Some of you might think that I sometimes get lost in the weeds, and let's see if I can move this one along and tell a story that you might hear sitting around a campfire in the Rocky Mountains. The exploration of and expansion into the area that would become the western United States is filled with countless heroes and villains. It contains more twists and turns than any mystery novel, and the reality of the events is stranger than fiction. Now, I've been fascinated with this period in history since early childhood, and I'm not sure why, but I suspect it has something to do with the streak of independence and self-reliance I've always possessed, sometimes independence to a fault. To my own detriment, I do not like to seek assistance in most things. I enjoy solitude and figuring out things for myself, working on things in silence. And when I was younger, I associated many of those attributes with the life of a solitary mountain man in the American West. But as I've gotten older and studied them, I've learned that few of these men really lived in complete solitude. Nevertheless, the romanticism of that time, it still draws me in, and I intentionally overlook the hardships that they suffered. But as I wrote up the final points on my research for this episode, I also recalled another important, although until at that point largely forgotten, influence on my young mind. You see, when I was about 10 years old, the TV series The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams, starring Dan Haggerty, well, that became my favorite TV show. I watched every episode, and I couldn't wait to see the next one. Although I didn't know it at the time, and only recalled it after working on this episode, one of the characters in the show, Mad Jack, played by Denver Pyle, made a tremendous impression on me. Now, Mad Jack wandered in and out of each episode with his old burro, Number 7, who was cleverly named Number 7 because he was the 7th animal Jack had owned during his time in the mountains. At that time, I hadn't considered the fact that he had 7 burros during that period of time, but just now as I was thinking about it, think about the lifespan of a burro. According to references, domestic burros live 30 or 40 years, with some living as long as 50. So Jack must have been in the mountains a long, long time. Come to think of it, a burro would be associated more with a desert miner than a mountain trapper anyway. But I digress. Jack traveled and trapped or mined or whatever alone, and although the show only really showed his interactions with Grizzly Adams in or near Adams' cabin, well, the lone mountain man must have left quite an impression on my mind. I suppose this illustrates how small events in our lives may have tremendous results. But that's enough reminiscing for now. I want to take you on a trip as we skim the surface of several characters and stories from that period. We will return to these one by one in later episodes. Francis Parkman, who traveled west in 1846 and chronicled his experiences in his book The Oregon Trail, wrote the quote I want to use as a sort of jumping off point on this discussion. "I defy the annals of chivalry to furnish the record of a life more wild and perilous than that of a Rocky Mountain trapper." Indeed, if you read the journals of those who were present at that time, you'll find how tenuous life could be. Historian Robert Utley might have offered the best description of the motives for and results of the inexorable westward movement of those who became so associated with the western mountains. Utley's quote is, "In the fertile mind of Thomas Jefferson himself stirred nebulous visions of a continental destiny for the American people, if not for the United States itself. Even more than geographical revelation, therefore, the history of the United States in the first half of the 19th century is a saga of national expansion, a raucous, relentless, continuous drama, of themes both bright and dark that deposited the western boundary on the Pacific shore. In these two great movements of American history, exploration and national expansion, a gathering of colorful and eccentric men numbering less than 1,000 at one time played a decisive part. They were the mountain men, the bold adventurers who sought individual freedom and financial reward in the beaver streams of the Rocky Mountains. In their allotted span on the western scene, hardly more than a generation, they came to know the American West as well as the Indians whose trails they followed. And what they learned did not remain locked in their minds. It began to seep out in their own time and cascaded forth as their time ran out." In 1764, Pierre Laclede and his stepson Auguste Chateau, they founded the settlement called St. Louis. In the last episode, we talked about how that was the beginning, although there was trade up and down the Mississippi, and voyagers had been traveling up and down the Mississippi from and to the Great Lakes for many, many years. The settlement of St. Louis began something new, that confluence of the Missouri River coming in from the western North America and intersecting with this major highway north and south through the center of the country. Well, that was something that opened up a lot of trade. And the Mississippi, the major navigable north-south waterway between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico, had been a thoroughfare for traders who were trying to capitalize on the beaver harvests deep in the North American continent. Depending upon the market and depending upon who was in control of Louisiana at the time, New Orleans at the time, well, the beaver trade, the furs, could flow in either direction. And so if we think about that, it's easy to see how St. Louis became so important. Now, St. Louis was situated just south of the confluence with the Missouri River, the major east-west river from the Rockies. And St. Louis was founded just in time to capitalize on the westward expansion of America and on the American Revolution. The major North American fur trade center in the 17th and 18th centuries was Montreal. The Hudson's Bay Company was working that territory north of Montreal and extending those trade networks into what is today central Canada and the north central United States even. In the last episode, we talked about the traders moving into North Dakota, South Dakota, even perhaps going as far as the Bighorn Mountains. But French traders were working through the Great Lakes and extending their own trade networks into those areas until France surrendered that territory to England in the mid-18th century. The American Revolution resulted in reduced trade on the Great Lakes, and much of that trade, which would have moved through the Great Lakes in Quebec, was shipped instead through the Hudson's Bay to the north and the Mississippi to the south, trying to avoid the contested area in the northeastern American colonies. Now, new trading posts were established along both the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers during this period of time. And as the American Revolution wound down, another much more serious threat to the Indians of the central North American plains started to develop. In fact, this was following right in the tracks of the white traders and trappers. Diseases like smallpox, which was the scourge of every native tribe from the Americas, had already decimated the Indian villages along the North Atlantic seaboard. And from our 21st century perspective, it's difficult to imagine the decimation that smallpox inflicted on the tribes in the Americas. A good example of the scale of this decimation is made clear when we examine the writings of 16th century explorer Giovanni de Verrazzano, who sailed north from the Carolinas along the North American coastline in 1523. Now, he found the coast to be densely populated and smoky with Indian bonfires. Now, think about that. So many tribes and so many people along the North American coast, from the Carolinas to New York, essentially, that the entire area was smoky from those bonfires. I don't know about you, but whenever I was growing up, I was really convinced that there just weren't many people in North and South America. But it simply isn't true. Go back and read Charles Mann's 1491. Great book, and it'll tell you what some of the thinking is with regard to populations of the natives in the Americas prior to the discovery, and I'm using air quotes here, of North America by Columbus. So what we find is that the Americas were really not, as we have been led to believe, that sparsely populated. In 1605 and 1606, Samuel de Champlain, who we discussed in episode 2, originally sought to establish a French colony on Cape Cod, but he found the area so crowded with Indians that he abandoned the idea entirely. And yet, when a European ship sailed along the coast of Maine and into Narragansett Bay in 1619, the coast was utterly void of people. Everything which had indicated a developed and thriving set of communities with healthy and productive people living in them had been turned upside down completely. Things were overgrown and had tumbled into a state of disrepair which indicated years of abandonment. This area of New England was hit especially hard, and it covered about 8,000 square miles, and it was essentially deserted. The experts now think that this decimation was not the work of smallpox, but was some sort of viral hepatitis, and it was likely spread by contaminated food. According to witnesses, the Indians died in heaps as they lay in their houses. Unable to cope with the scale of the catastrophe, those who were healthy, they abandoned their homes and villages, and they fled to other areas and other tribes. But as they went, they carried the disease along with them to spread among those people as well. From 1616 till at least 1619, the disease decimated the native tribes, and when the dust settled, perhaps as much as 90% of the native population of New England lay dead. So we can see that from about 1605, the early 1600s, until around 15 to 20 years later, a dramatic shift in population occurred, at least in that part of New England. And because the trading and social interactions of the tribes would have allowed them to interact with each other frequently, the disease would have spread quickly. Now we can take a look at a much more recent example of the deadly impact of an epidemic to an unexposed population which took place in South America in the 20th century with the Siriano tribe. Living remotely in Bolivia and virtually unexposed to Europeans until the early 20th century, this tribe would be representative of all tribes which were exposed initially to European diseases. Some researchers think that at least 3,000 Siriano lived in eastern Bolivia before the outbreaks of smallpox and influenza dropped their numbers to somewhere around 150 people in the 1920s. Now that's more than 95% of the tribe which died, according to the theories. And that had devastating impacts on the survivors and on the culture that had existed. By the mid-1700s, epidemics were decimating the tribes of Central North America. Records show that the Assiniboines of the central northern plains were rocked by smallpox somewhere around 1780. And there were rumors there that almost no natives survived the infection. Those who traded with the Assiniboines brought news that 3/4 of the tribe had died within a few months. Based on historical numbers and reports, 75% seems to be a low mortality rate compared to most. But it's clear that their numbers were reduced incredibly quickly. And the survivors had to sort out not only the disease, but the pressure of competing tribes and the white trappers, traders, and settlers who were moving into their homelands. As Benjamin Franklin drafted the proposal for what would become the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War, he insisted on 4 necessary points. The United States must be an independent nation. The fisheries off the east coast of the United States must be accessible to U.S. fishermen. The Mississippi River must be the western boundary of the United States, and the Mississippi must be open for American shipping. But in truth, the United States didn't really enjoy free and open shipping on the Mississippi. Only Britain did, until a separate treaty with Spain was signed in 1795, which allowed free navigation and deposit at New Orleans. Now that the combatants had made peace, the work of the fur industry was reignited in the Great Lakes region. In 1784, the Northwest Company of Montreal, a confederation of 9 groups of traders and powerful merchants, was organized. This organization used a different business model from the Hudson Bay Company. Some of the organizing partners had worked at the fur outposts which were spread out across the continent, and they understood the need to provide extra motivation to the officers who occupied those positions. As a result, while all Hudson's Bay men, except for the directors who worked from across the sea in England, were employees of the company, the Northwest Company offered their officers working at the fur outposts what we would call profit sharing, maybe even a stake in ownership. And it's important for the future of both companies and the fur industry in general to notice this difference. By offering these men a stake in the growth and profits of the enterprise, you could call it skin in the game, the company provided the fuel to sustain the company's dramatic growth. Meanwhile, France was boiling. It was going to erupt in violence on July 14, 1789, when thousands of Parisians attacked the Bastille fortress. This was the beginning of the end of the monarchy in France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, issued on August 26, 1789, was the founding document of that nation's movement to provide equality and freedom to the average citizen. Although Louis XVI would remain king until September 21, 1792, when the monarchy was abolished, his powers were limited, and a long period of distrust, leading to violence and mass execution, had begun. Louis himself was executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793. As a result of what happened in France, the other monarchies in Europe began to feel the heat. The revolutions in both the United States and France had cast off the rule of the monarchs and was a direct threat to the peace in their own countries. England, Spain, and other monarchies declared war on France. The country endured years of instability and terror, and ultimately Napoleon would lead a coup in 1799. Now this is going to be important because New Orleans was nominally owned by Spain, but it was in fact controlled to a much greater degree by Britain. The city was the center of trade for the fur traders from the center of the continent. Spain tried to control the trade and tried to collect taxes from British traders and merchants, but enforcement was difficult, and even rules forbidding colonists from trading with the British were largely ignored. Into this mix of conflicting relationships came the Company of Explorers of the Upper Missouri, commonly called the Missouri Company, which was organized in St. Louis in 1793. The first 2 expeditions to the west organized by the company were dismal failures. And finally, in August 1795, James Mackay, a veteran of the western trade from his time with the Northwest Company, left St. Louis with 33 men and set off up the Missouri River. This expedition cost 104,000 pesos and was intended to search out a passage to the Pacific, as well as construct forts as necessary to protect the Spanish trade. We can see that this myth of an all-water trade route to the Pacific was still out there. Even though Aristotle once said, "Well begun is half done," he never undertook to venture west with the mission Mackay had been given. After arriving at the Odo village at the mouth of the Platte, Mackay was met with demands from the tribe for protection from their enemies who had recently bought guns. Now, Mackay built a small fort and promised to install small swivel guns later. He then stationed traders at the fort to work on luring trade away from the British. The nearby Omaha tribe also demanded a fort, and one was built for them, along with promises for the future installation of cannon at their fort. Blackbird, the chief of the Omaha, promised to lead the expedition upstream and make introductions to the Rees, the Arikara, the Sioux, and other tribes when the river ice broke up in the spring. But Blackbird demanded a high price for his assistance. He got his choice of goods which passed his village on the Missouri, and he wasn't happy with the merchandise Mackay brought. He insisted that Mackay send a boat back to St. Louis to get the things he needed. And of course, this added to the cost of the expedition. During this time, Mackay made plans to explore the frozen western plains, and he sent one of his men, John Evans, out with a party to work on developing relationships with the Indians. Although the story of his travels and interactions with the Indians, traders, and trappers from Canada read like an adventure novel, Evans failed in his effort, and the only tangible results were his journals. With expenses mounting and results lacking, the rumors grew back in St. Louis and New Orleans. Some thought that Mackay and Evans were British spies, using Spanish pesos to fund their efforts to build the British trade networks. Although none of this was true, Spain's declaration of war with France didn't relieve any of the tensions between those governments and those who lived and worked on the frontier. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress had been contemplating the fur trade in the territories it possessed, and at this time, those were primarily east of the Mississippi River. On April 18, 1796, the United States Government Fur Trade Factory System Act was authorized by Congress. Funds were allocated to set up government factories to trade with the Indians in those territories. To fully understand this, let's define the term factory as applied in this context. Based on the Latin word factorium, meaning place of doers or agents, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, the term essentially described a trading post where an agent was set up to represent the trading organization. As we've seen, the French government, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and other organizations had all been utilizing the outpost system for years prior to the passage of this act. But in the U.S. system, things differed slightly. The government owned the trading posts or factories, which an official representative of the government, the agent or factor, ran. Shipments of goods, cloth, tools, blankets, kettles, weapons, gunpowder, etc., were received and stocked for trade with the Indians. The goal of these factories was not to make a profit, but to simply cover the cost of doing business. They were not to be a profit center. They were there to supply the market with reasonable terms for the products they wanted to buy. They were also there to supply a market for the furs, the skins, the beeswax, and other items produced by the tribes, so that they had a market for their goods as well, which would be accepted and sent east to be sold. But of primary interest was providing some fair trade values, helping prevent the exploitation of the tribes by private traders who negotiated for much higher prices and also sold alcohol, to counter the trading networks of the British, and to create an environment in which the tribes would be dependent upon American goods rather than those supplied by the British. One problem with the system was the relative inferiority of the products produced in America. Contemporary information show that the tribes normally preferred the higher quality British trade goods, and they would refuse the other goods when they were perceived to be of lesser quality. Another problem was the constant criticism of the system by private traders like John Jacob Astor with his American Fur Company. But for now, just file the factory system away in your mind because we're going to revisit it shortly. On October 1st, 1800, the Spanish, fearing a British invasion of the Louisiana Territory, agreed to trade it to France in return for Tuscany, the kingdom of Etruria, which is hard for me to say, Etruria, a territory in Italy, but it was Tuscany. The secret treaty of San Ildefonso documented the agreement, but the public confirmation and transfer of the territory did not occur until March 21st, 1801. Spain officially returned Louisiana to French control in New Orleans on November 30th, 1803, and just 20 days later, Napoleon Bonaparte sold 828,000 square miles of land to the United States for $15 million, the equivalent of $430 million today. In today's dollars, that would be $519 per square mile. That's a bargain. More than doubling the size of the United States, this whole new neighborhood stretched from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. Maurice Sandoz has called the area covered in the Louisiana Purchase the largest practically unbroken, pasturable, arable, irrigable region in the world, with the vast buffalo herds that would one day help finance the railroads needed to cross it. The story of this, the largest acquisition of land in U.S. history, is fascinating, and we will revisit that in a later podcast. Another of those IOUs I keep writing. Enter Thomas Jefferson here. Jefferson had long believed that the future of the American experiment would be realized not just in the 13 original colonies along the eastern seaboard, but also in the Trans-Mississippi region, the area west of the Mississippi. And the instability in France, Spain, and Britain during the late 1700s caused a lot of concern. Questions like, would Britain allow the Americans living on the eastern shore of the river access to the river for trade? Would Spain allow trade downriver to the port of New Orleans? And experience showed that none of these countries were stable. All were striving to better their own prospects, often at the expense of the others, and each country had to take care of itself. For now, the important thing was that the Mississippi and Missouri rivers were in the possession of the United States, and any lack of clarity about the ownership of either was settled. Thomas Jefferson had led this bold move to bring the United States closer to his dream of a country that reached, literally, from sea to shining sea. Now the question was, what had he bought? And although traders, trappers, miners, adventurers of all sorts from Europe had traveled across much of the continent, well, there were few written records and virtually no sharing of information between the countries. 828,000 miles requires a lot of legwork if you want to explore what's there. In this case, it's legwork and paddling, poling, cordelling, riding, you name it. These explorations we'll discuss in much greater detail in later podcasts, another IOU. But as with everything that I try to do, there's got to be a first, and it's now that we come to the point at which I thought I would begin episode 2, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, I won't take the time that's going to be required to delve too deeply into the expedition itself. Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery, those are pretty well-known events and names in the history of the country. But this is a marker that we're going to drop here on our way to the discussion of the trappers and mountain men. We're going to return to the expedition in the future, though, so it will deserve at least one episode in the future. And if you'll subscribe and stay tuned, I'll have that to you as soon as I can get that one churned out. But before we do that, we want to take a step back and think about Thomas Jefferson. Let's go back and look at the impetus, if we will, for the Louisiana Purchase and for Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. Jefferson first heard of a proposed trip up the Missouri River in search of a route to the Pacific Ocean from a teacher he had when he was 10 years old. And from the end of the American Revolution until his election as president, he had dreamed of exploring the North American continent. So he had proposed a lot of other expeditions, or at least a few. One involved George Rogers Clark in 1783. And if the name Clark sounds familiar, it's because he's a brother of William Clark. That one fell through, though, because of a lack of funding and political instability at the time. 1783, the new nation was still trying to sort things out. Another came around in 1792 involving André Michaux, a noted French botanist, and that one was canceled after it became clear that Michaux was clandestinely working as a political operative for the French government. The explorations of Alexander Mackenzie, however, who worked for the Northwest Company and made his way across Canada to the Pacific Ocean in 1793, reignited Jefferson's desire to explore possible paths to the Pacific below the 49th parallel. Although he was frustrated by the failed attempts at moving his dream forward, Jefferson benefited from those failures. He was able, for instance, to take what he learned from them, coupled with other information from other sources which were updated as the years went by, and he was able to further define his vision for that project. When the opportunity finally presented itself to make the proposal to Congress in January 1803, Jefferson was ready. He could communicate clearly the scientific and diplomatic goals that he envisioned for this journey. And he could discuss in some detail why the expedition would require $2,500, or in today's terms, about $72,000. And that was the amount that he requested. And by this time, he had a man in mind for these enormous responsibilities. If we think back, as Jefferson was planning what would become the Michaud expedition, an 18-year-old friend and neighbor asked to lead the expedition. Now, he wasn't given the honor, but it was clear that this young man, a fellow named Meriwether Lewis, craved excitement and wanted the ability to explore with the sanction of the government. Now, because he was 18 years old and inexperienced, he was turned down for that expedition. But he still wanted those same things. He still wanted the excitement, and he wanted the ability to explore. So he joined the Virginia Volunteer Corps as a private during the Whiskey Rebellion. He later received a commission as an ensign in the Virginia militia, and he served under another Virginia neighbor, Captain William Clark. The two developed a friendship and a mutual admiration. Lewis was promoted to captain in December of 1800, and in February 1801, Thomas Jefferson was elected president. Jefferson dreamed big. His vision for America was what he called an empire of liberty, which would be the jumping-off point for populating the continent with free people who thought, spoke, and were governed in similar ways. To govern effectively, Jefferson would need the advice and support of a person he could trust. Although many others applied for the position, Jefferson only had one man in mind. In February 1801, before he was inaugurated, Jefferson wrote to Meriwether Lewis, stating that Lewis' knowledge of the West, the Army, and many other varied interests would be a great asset to the new president. He asked Lewis to become his secretary, which would later be described as more of an aide-de-camp. And although his pay would be roughly equivalent to his military pay, he was allowed to retain his rank and right to promotion. He would live in what would become the White House, since he would essentially be one of Jefferson's family. Given that he had really nothing to lose and a tremendous amount to gain, Lewis accepted the position, and he arrived in Washington on April 1st. Jefferson and Lewis worked very closely together. Since Jefferson had no family living with him in the White House, he and Lewis ate together and spent the evenings together, often entertaining guests. Jefferson became a father figure to Lewis, and in the process of entertaining and speaking with guests in the evening, Lewis found himself present for deep conversations on all sorts of topics: politics, geography, science, navigation, the Indians of the West, philosophy, literature, history. All those and more were topics for discussion. And in truth, Lewis obtained a graduate degree, and probably more, during his time in this role. Noted historian and Lewis biographer Stephen Ambrose also thinks that Jefferson taught Lewis something even more important. He taught him how to write effectively, noting the difference in writing style before 1800 and after 1802. And it was in mid to late 1802 that the decision was made to put Lewis in charge of an expedition to the Pacific. To assist in his thorough preparation, Lewis was placed in a fast-track study program for all things navigational and scientific. He spent a great deal of time in Philadelphia with the leading scientists of the era. And of course, Lewis would simultaneously have to plan the expedition itself, using Jefferson's instructions as a basis. The two spent hours together working on the details of those plans. Now, I'm a fan of a fellow named Jocko Willink and his podcast, and I'm a fan of his take on leadership. In his books and on his podcast, Willink discusses the importance of communicating the commander's intent to subordinates. This is especially important when it's necessary to delegate authority to subordinates who are going to be geographically separated from the commander, but pursuing the commander's goals for the mission. If those subordinates understand what the commander wants to accomplish, then they can exercise good judgment in place of rigidly established rules for governing whatever the undertaking might be. The rules could never account for every possible event anyway, and so there has to be some room to allow the interpretation of commander's intent and the authority to act upon that from the subordinate whenever they are not close to the commander. Now, this is what I envision as the primary benefit of the work Jefferson and Lewis did during that time. No other person could have been better informed or had a better understanding of what Jefferson wanted to accomplish with the expedition than Meriwether Lewis. On June 19, 1803, Lewis wrote William Clark, informing him of the expedition and of the commander's intent. He was planning to travel to Clarksville, Indian Territory, and was just across the river from what is Louisville, Kentucky today, to meet with Clark personally. Lewis described the expedition in these words: "My plan is to descend the Ohio in a keeled boat, thence up the Mississippi to the mouth of the Missouri, and up that river as far as its navigation is practicable with a keeled boat. There to prepare canoes of bark or rawhides and proceed to its, the Missouri's, source, and if practicable, pass over to the waters of the Columbia or Oregon River, and by descending it, reach the Western Ocean." Lewis explained that he was authorized by Jefferson to hire non-commissioned officers and men as he chose, and to engage anyone else, not a soldier, that might be of assistance in the journey. And in Lewis' words, "Thus, my friend, you have a summary view of the plan, the means, and the objects of this expedition. If therefore there is anything under those circumstances in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors, believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself." Lewis went on to explain that he had spoken with Jefferson about this, and that Jefferson hoped that Clark would join the endeavor. In Lewis's words, "He has authorized me to say that in the event of your accepting this proposition, he will grant you a captain's commission, which, of course, will entitle you to the pay and emoluments attached to that office, and will equally with myself entitle you to such portion of land as was granted to officers of similar rank for their revolutionary services. Your situation, if joined with me in this mission, will, in all respects, be precisely such as my own." And so, one of the great partnerships in the annals of history was formed. Lewis and Clark, although close in age, Clark was 4 years older, had distinctly different personalities. This is an interesting thing because we often hear that as a leader, we need to surround ourselves with people who think differently and are able to complement what we do. We don't want to surround ourselves with people who have the same characteristics, because then if there are weaknesses, if we do have some sort of weakness, we don't have the people who can make up for that. Lewis was quiet and introverted, while Clark was an outgoing, practical, and optimistic person. Both were intelligent and accustomed to travel and working outdoors. Their friendship endured well beyond the journey they were about to embark upon, and they remained close until Lewis's untimely death. Jefferson believed that it would take at least 1,000 years for immigrants to fill the new Louisiana Territory, but he was anxious to gather intelligence on the area regardless. While rumors of all sorts were widely distributed, Jefferson, ever the scientist, wanted data. Lewis would be his eyes and ears, his boots on the ground, and Jefferson prepared an instruction letter telling Lewis precisely what he hoped the journey would accomplish. Now remember, they'd already spent months, years talking about what this journey ought to be. So Jefferson wanted to make doubly sure that what his commander's intent was well understood by Lewis. The explorers were not searching for cities of gold or lost mines. Instead, they were to ascend the Missouri to the source, cross the Rocky Mountains by the best means possible, and find the best route and method of travel to the Pacific Ocean. Developing friendly relations with the Indians was one of the objectives, as was mapping out the geography and collecting the data on the flora and fauna along the route. After careful and lengthy planning and gathering up the boats and materials that they would need to make the journey, the Corps of Discovery departed Wood River, Illinois, just 5 months after the official transfer of the Louisiana Territory to the United States. The journey began on the rainy afternoon of May 14, 1804. The permanent party consisted of 14 soldiers from the U.S. Army and 9 recently recruited young frontiersmen from Kentucky. Earning the trust and the endorsement of these 2 captains was not an easy thing. They required young men who were not married, already accustomed to woodcraft, good hunters, healthy, stout, and capable of the heavy burden of the exhausting work and travel that was to come. Now, your rank and standing in the community, although it may be important to you and to those around you at the time, would not assure you a place with Lewis and Clark. This was no place for participation trophies. Every man had to be a winner in his own way. Along with these young men, the group included 2 French boatmen, Captain Clark's Negro servant York, the civilian interpreter George Drouillard, and Captain Lewis' Newfoundland dog Seaman, as well as 2 horses. Another party of soldiers and rivermen would accompany the group to the Mandan villages before returning to St. Louis. The winter of 1804 and 1805 would be spent in the Mandan villages before pointing west in spring 1805. Now, while I would love to continue discussing the Lewis and Clark expedition, this is where I need to leave them. They obviously moved west, learned a great deal about the territory, and wintered successfully at Fort Clatsop near Cape Disappointment at the mouth of the Columbia River in 1805 and 1806. We will revisit this incredible expedition and cover it in great detail in another episode, but for now, let's just say that the woodsmen who traveled with Lewis and Clark got a graduate level course of their own on the western lands. They hunted extensively, learned at least a basic level of communication with the natives, and developed a basic understanding of the geography of the area. Our story takes an interesting turn here because when the Corps was traveling back down the Missouri in August of 1806, they met 2 men, Joseph Dixon and Forrest Hancock, traveling up the river by canoe in hopes of making a fortune by trapping beaver. These entrepreneurs needed intelligence on the region's suitability for trapping beaver. One member of the party, Virginian John Colter, had done a bit of trapping during the expedition and was willing to join the duo as a full partner. He sought and received discharge from his military obligations, and he headed back upriver for what he thought would be a 2-year stay. And so, at least in my mind, the first mountain man headed back west. Now, obviously, John Colter was not the first mountain man. Both the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company had been sending trappers to the western mountains for decades. John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company would soon be working in the Pacific Northwest with a headquarters in Astoria, Oregon. And while I want to spend more time discussing each of these companies in detail, the work they did prior to this time frame doesn't really advance our story. We'll get back to them soon. In the meanwhile, Colter, Dixon, and Hancock eagerly and naively ventured onto the rivers of the Rocky Mountains, seeking their fortune. And I say naively because, as so often happens in life, some friction occurred between the men. Colter liked to work alone, and by the spring of 1807, he had left the partnership and was traveling back down the Missouri in a canoe with the pelts he had collected over the winter. It was at this point that fortune took yet another turn, and he ran into George Drouillard, Peter Weiser, and John Potts, veterans of the Corps of Discovery, who were traveling upriver with Manuel Liza and somewhere between 40 and 60 other men. According to accounts from his contemporaries, Liza had an abrasive personality and was not well liked. But these men were in search of beaver trapping grounds for the winter, and Colter's old commander, Captain William Clark, who would soon become governor of the Missouri Territory, was an associate of Lisa's. Now, Lisa asked Colter if he wanted to join the group, and Colter abandoned his plans of heading back to St. Louis and civilization. He had been in the wilderness for over 3 years, but Colter loaded his things into the keelboat and headed back west as a hunter and guide for the party. So now we know how John Colter came to be a part of Manuel Liza's expedition, but we need to follow what happened to that expedition as they headed upriver. They were going to face an uphill battle. They were moving into the headwaters of the Missouri, and they knew that they were moving into the territory occupied by the Crow, the Flathead, the Shoshone, and most importantly, the Blackfoot tribes. Now, the Blackfoot tribe had depended upon the traders from both the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, so they weren't going to switch alliances easily. The Crows became the trading partner for the new company for that very reason, and that created a situation that was ripe for hostility and also for violence between those two tribes. Those trappers who ventured out to trap the remote streams of the upper Missouri and the rest of the streams in the Rocky Mountains, they found themselves subject to constant attack by the Blackfeet, who were relentless in their violent attacks. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, my young mind crafted stories of these men that placed them alone in the wilderness, trapping fur and living off the land virtually without care. But nothing could have been further from the truth. Colter and the men who were part of Lisa's effort were among the earliest organized American groups of trappers, and they led a rough and extremely dangerous life. existing in the space occupied by the Blackfeet made things even worse. They worked really hard. By necessity, much of their work had to be done in the cold, sometimes ice-covered mountain streams, because the season of prime beaver fur was early spring, when fur-bearing animals had grown their thickest, most impressive winter coats. And these were the coats which would bring the best prices because of their high quality. These were the ones that were called the prime fur. Now, just for a moment, let's put ourselves in the moccasins of a mountain trapper and imagine just a part of their day. They were up early, often before daylight on those cold mornings. If they had a breakfast, it would have been dried meat. They might have cooked a breakfast of buffalo, deer, elk, bear, or mountain lion, and they would have sipped perhaps a hot cup of coffee. Then they were off, searching for new beaver grounds, looking for damaged trees, beaver ponds, dams, slides, or running their traps. They might have spent the day traveling to go to new spots to do some trapping as well. When they found sign of the beaver, they would often walk through the water to limit the amount of scent they left behind so that they wouldn't warn the beavers away. Those signs would have included something like a beaver slide, where the beaver slid into the water from the ground. They would have seen trees that had been gnawed on by the beavers. They would see the dams or the lakes that were created, or the beaver ponds, I should say, that would have been created by the dams the beavers built. Often working as a team, with one person keeping watch and another setting the traps, they would set the traps about 4 inches under the surface of the water, staked to the stream bed so that the beavers couldn't drag them away when they were caught. A stick was covered with a special mixture to attract the beavers to the trap. This was something the men called coming to medicine. And then that stick was leaned over the trap so that the beaver had to step in the trap to smell the stick. The trap was attached to the stake in the stream bed by a heavy chain, and it was placed in such a fashion that once the beaver was caught, it was going to be dragged underwater and it was going to drown. Captain Meriwether Lewis described one version of this medicine as including castor, taken from the beaver sex glands, half a nutmeg, a dozen grains of cloves, and 30 grains of cinnamon, ground together and mixed with spirits. Allspice could be used in place of the cloves if the cloves were not available. And while this medicine could be used right away, Lewis said that it was best to let it ripen for a few days or even months. And ripen indeed. Can you imagine the smell? The trappers returned in a day or two as they ran their trap line, and then they checked to see what they had caught. Now, the catch was typically skinned on the spot and the pelt processed for storage and transportation when they returned to camp. They walked or rode horses for miles each day. They crossed streams and traveled through remote mountain valleys and over high passes to the next promising area. It was a beautifully simple but incredibly risky and incredibly taxing profession. The beaver skins would have been bound up in bales, and they would have carried them around or cached them for later when they could come back and pick them up. It required a lot of effort and a lot of work. We can think about the dress and the actions of these early trappers as well. They likely resembled Indians more than anything in the white man's civilized world. They wore buckskins and moccasins, which could be readily manufactured from the skins of animals in the area. They would have originally come into the area with boots and, of course, wool and other types of homespun garments, but they would have quickly worn out. And there was nothing so important as to have the ability to produce what you needed on the spot. The buckskin shirts and leggings that would have been worn were not the pristine golden-hued clothes that we might think of. In the days prior to disposable napkins, these men would have wiped their hands on the buckskins themselves. Everything from the bait they were using for the beaver to the grease left on their hands after eating, to the blood from skinning the animals would have been wiped on the buckskins. And as a result, it's been said that the trappers' clothes were a dirty, greasy, shiny, bloody, stinky black. That sounds really appealing, doesn't it? They carried knives and tomahawks, pistols, powder horns, rifles, and a possible sack, a kind of a catch-all for whatever it might be possible for them to need. And in speaking of the knives they would have carried, there was a popular skinning knife that they would have used called the Green River knife. And as I read about that, I started thinking that I thought at first that it was in reference to the Green River in Wyoming, where so many of the rendezvous were held. But no, it was based upon a company out of Green River, Massachusetts, and it was started by John Russell, I believe, if I remember correctly. That company today is still in business, although it's changed somewhat. Dexter-Russell is the company today. still making knives, still making a version of the Green River knife, skinning knives and those types of things, which you can buy today. So that's just a little bit of a little tidbit there for us as well, that we can actually patronize and buy products from a U.S. company which produces a product that would be similar to what would have been used by these mountain men back then. Now, those men would have learned woodcraft also from the natives. They would have learned to read the weather and the trails and the sign they would have seen. And as they continued their search for beavers, they would have had to be vigilant against attacks from their enemies, or even relatively friendly tribes, for that matter, who were interested in stealing what they had. In fact, I was reading this morning that there was nothing that the Crow tribe liked better. And remember, the Crow tribe was, in essence, the friendly tribe to the trappers. It was the tribe that they were going to trade with, live among, and often intermarry with. So they were the tribe that would have been the most friendly toward the white trappers. But even the Crows saw it as a great game to go steal horses from white trappers. They didn't want to kill the trappers. They didn't want to drive them out of the territory. They wanted them to keep coming back so that they would have a ready supply of horses for stealing. Isn't that an interesting perspective on things? You've got to have those horses brought into your territory to be able to steal them, so you don't want to kill the people who are bringing them into the territory. And in fact, the diaries of the men who lived to tell the stories often reveal that the theft or loss of their horses was common. They lost their traps. They lost their furs to Indians. And in reading through the journal of Osborne Russell, he makes numerous references to lost horses and even to an encounter with members of the Crow tribe who threatened to take everything he and a companion had until the men showed that they were determined to fight for their belongings. I think it likely that the alliances of the tribe were much less important than the character and intentions of the men involved, both white and Indian, in that moment. So let's take a few minutes now to cover John Colter's story. I know I said earlier that I wasn't going to talk about any one particular person, but Colter's story isn't very long, and I think it is kind of representative of the typical life of a trapper and mountain man during this early period. And in fact, this episode, The First Mountain Man, deals in my mind with John Colter, who, from my perspective, would have been the first mountain man that we could track. As with most of the trappers and mountain men from his era, Colter's stay in the Rocky Mountains wasn't going to be a permanent thing. He was going to be there for a few years, and he was going to move on. During the winter of 1807 and 1808, he, George Drouillard, and Edward Rose were sent out to various Indian winter camps to scout for good beaver streams and to spread the word that Manuel Liza had established a trading post at the confluence of the Bighorn and Yellowstone rivers. This trading post was the first building erected in what is now the state of Montana, and it was named Fort Raymond, or Fort Raymond, after Liza's 2-year-old son. Although Colter did not document any of his travels through the Rocky Mountains that winter, we know that he did cover somewhere around 500 miles of snow-covered mountains carrying only his rifle and a 30-pound sack. He visited not only the Crow camps, but also the camps of other tribes that he found in the area. Now, we don't know Colter's precise route. In fact, it's been contested for quite some time. But we do know that he crossed the Bighorn Basin and the upper Wind River area. So far as we know, he was the first white man to see what we now call Jackson Hole and the beautiful Grand Tetons, which are so popular today. He traveled across Teton Pass and dropped down into what is now eastern Idaho at Pierre's Hole, crossed back and skirted Jackson Lake. He saw the beautiful Yellowstone Lake and the numerous geological oddities in that area. And although he didn't make it into the geyser basins west of Yellowstone Lake, he did travel down the Stinking Water River, so named because of the rotten egg smell created by high sulfur content from geothermal activity in that area. Today, this is the Shoshone River, and that area came to be called Colter's Hell because of the stories Colter told fellow mountain men about what we now know were fumaroles, hot springs, and sulfurous vents just west of modern-day Cody, Wyoming. Colter and Drouillard both covered a lot of ground over that winter. Drouillard saw Colter's Hell as well, but he traveled mostly east and south of Fort Raymond, not into the mountain passes seen by Colter. Edward Rose, on the other hand, he found a Crow camp, gave away the goods he had brought to trade, and spent the winter there in relative warmth and comfort. Rose is going to reappear in subsequent adventures, and in almost none of them does he acquit himself very well. In the summer of 1808, Liza and Drouillard went back to St. Louis. Colter, who was assigned to bring in more Indians to trade, was returning to Fort Raymond with a party of Flathead Indians he had met when, at a point about 15 miles up the Gallatin from the Three Forks area, the group was attacked by Blackfoot warriors. The group, along with some nearby Crow warriors who had joined the fight, drove the Blackfeet away. But Colter, who was very active in the fight, was wounded in the leg. The Blackfeet noted Colter's participation in the fight and would remember him when they met later. After recuperating at Fort Raymond, Colter and fellow Corps of Discovery veteran John Potts set off to trap the Three Forks area in the fall. Now, anyone who studied the history of the region knows that the Three Forks area was a favorite territory of the Blackfeet, so one would naturally expect trouble to follow. And as the partners were traveling up the Jefferson River in separate canoes, a group of Blackfoot warriors appeared on the banks and demanded that they come ashore. Colter tossed his traps into the water immediately and swung his canoe toward the banks, while Potts waited. The Blackfoot warriors quickly seized Colter's weapons and stripped him naked. Potts, who still refused to come ashore, was shot in the hip by one of the warriors, and as he raised up from the bottom of the canoe, Potts shot one of the warriors himself, killing him instantly. Enraged, the other warriors quickly killed Potts, pulled his canoe to shore, and there they butchered his corpse, throwing pieces of his body in Colter's face. Given the tension and the highly emotional state, Colter's explanation of what happened next kind of stretches the imagination. Nevertheless, Colter's tale goes like this. The warriors held a brief council on the spot. They were arguing for obviously very different outcomes. The leader approached the naked Colter, led him a distance away from the rest of the warriors, and I've seen this distance listed as a couple hundred yards, and motioned eastward, telling Colter in the Crow language to go away. Confused, Colter started walking away when he realized that this was a game. The Blackfeet wanted him to run so that they could chase him down and kill him as a sport. And remember that Colter was naked with no shoes on his feet, but he did have one thing that the Blackfeet didn't: motivation. And if he was to live, he had to outrun the entire group of warriors. By all accounts, John Colter was a powerful man. He was in outstanding physical condition, having walked and paddled, as well as ridden thousands of miles across the wilderness in search of beaver pelts. But we could also assume that his pursuers were equally well conditioned, having lived a similar lifestyle. Given the circumstances, this was a contest in the truest form of the word. As a young boy, I remember hearing tales of Colter's running the gauntlet, but I don't find any evidence that he actually ran a gauntlet as we might define it. Instead, what he did was run away from the Blackfeet as fast as he could. Now, I'm sure the warriors were confident, or why would they have given him such a head start? But Colter ran hard, heading for the Madison River, which was about 5 miles away, and pushing himself so hard that he was bleeding from his mouth and nose. Take a second, just 1 second, to imagine running for your life like this. It's difficult for us to understand, I think, in today's world. One by one, the Indians fell back until only one lone runner was sticking close. Realizing that this was his chance to take the offense, Colter spun around and grabbed the spear of the onrushing warrior. He pulled the man to the ground and broke the spear shaft. Colter was left holding a short section of the spear along with the head, which he turned on the warrior, stabbing him through the body. Colter then grabbed the man's blanket and took off at full speed again. As he reached the Madison River, Colter threw himself into the water and swam under a pile of driftwood which had lodged in the river. Now, I've seen it described as he ran under a beaver dam and he hid there. I've seen several different explanations of what he was hiding under, but a pile of driftwood sounds like it might be the most credible. At any rate, he hid beneath the pile of wood, holding his head up within some small air pockets and spaces where he could find air to breathe, while the furious warriors searched all around for him. Hours later, after the Blackfeet had left, Colter found himself alone on the banks of the Madison River with nothing but a wet blanket, a spear point, and 200 miles to travel back to Fort Raymond. Traveling almost constantly with only short rest breaks, eating roots and bark, and walking on feet torn to shreds by the rough country he was traversing, Colter reached Fort Raymond 11 days later. Colter's mad race for his life was the last such opportunity offered to any trapper by the Blackfoot tribe. Now, Colter recovered and determined to return to the Jefferson River. He wanted to retrieve the traps he had dropped there on the day John Potts was killed. And while camped on the Gallatin River cooking some buffalo meat over his fire, he heard twigs snap in the brush. He leapt into the darkness just as gunfire roared and the bullets tore into his camp, scattering the coals of his fire. He leaped into the darkness just as gunfire roared and the bullets tore into his camp, scattering the coals of his fire. Colter avoided the Indians in the night and immediately headed back to Fort Raymond, where he made a promise to God Almighty that he would never return to the region again if he were only permitted to escape once more with his life. Fort Raymond was closed in early 1809 because of terrible returns, and with only 15 beaver skins and 10 buffalo robes for the entire season's work, that makes sense. As well, the continuing animosity of the Blackfoot tribe just made it too risky. The reward was not going to equate to the risk and the number of people who were going to be lost. And Colter headed back downriver with Benito Vasquez, the chief factor of the fort. But in September 1809, Vasquez and his returning party met Manuel Liza on his way back up the Missouri once again with another expedition of more than 150 men and the trade goods that they were going to take to the area loaded onto 13 keelboats and barges. George Drouillard and Andrew Henry were present when the two groups met at the Mandan villages, and when Liza continued his trek upriver, John Colter was with them once again. Upriver, Andrew Henry split off with 40 men, Colter among them, to reopen Fort Raymond. Pierre Menard took the boats and cargo farther upriver to the Yellowstone, while Manuel Liza returned to St. Louis to outfit the next expedition, which would head upriver in 1810. After reopening the fort, Henry headed to the Three Forks region with 80 men to attempt to open that area to trapping by establishing a trading relationship with the Blackfeet. Demonstrating his selective amnesia, John Colter was again guiding this group. Sounds like things are going to go well, doesn't it? In April of 1810, the men began to build a log stockade at the confluence of the Jefferson and Madison rivers. While the building was progressing, some of the men, again led by John Colter, set out to trap around the area. A few days later, the Blackfeet attacked a group of 18 men, including John Colter, killing 2 and stealing traps, skins, ammunition, and horses. 3 men were missing. When Colter returned to the log stockade this time, he threw his hat to the ground and said, "Now, if God will only forgive me this time and let me off, I will leave the country day after tomorrow and be damned if I ever come into it again." And he did. After returning to St. Louis, Colter met with his old commander, Captain William Clark, now the agent for Indian Affairs in the Louisiana Territory, who was working on maps he and Meriwether Lewis had begun with the Corps of Discovery. Clark debriefed Colter and converted the information he provided into better maps of the area. Clark's map, engraved by Samuel Lewis, a Philadelphia map maker, was included in Nicholas Biddle's 1814 History of the Expedition under command of Captains Lewis and Clark. Unfortunately, John Colter didn't live to see the work he had helped to create. He cleared a plot of land, built a cabin, married, fathered a son, and after all the incredible close calls he had survived, died of jaundice in 1813. Although he wasn't even 40 years old when he died, Colter had lived several lifetimes of adventure prior to his return to civilization. And he was, indeed, at least in my mind, the first mountain man. It's at this point that I want to end this week's episode and continue the story in episode 4 next week, when John Jacob Astor and his Pacific Fur Company launch an ambitious project to capture the fur industry in the Pacific Northwest and establish the first permanent European settlement on the Pacific coast. Now, we'll also cover Ashley's 100 and the men associated with that expedition when they ventured into the wilderness in 1822 and 1823. Writing and producing this episode has been very rewarding for me. Every time I thought I knew much of the history associated with an event or character, I found out that I didn't really know much at all. Uncovering new tidbits has always been a thrill for me, and I get to relive that as I search for interesting accounts from this colorful time in our history. Each time I find a new resource and read through it, I find 2 additional resources I need to read. So the research continues, and I'm already hard at work on the next episode. I do want to take a moment to ask you to support a wonderful free internet resource. The Internet Archive, a nonprofit which can be accessed at archive.org, houses a wealth of information in many forms. I've enjoyed finding and reading many books about the fur trade and the men who risked so much to venture into the wilderness. I have many more to read and can't wait to dig in and share the stories I uncover. Almost none of those would be remotely possible without archive.org. So please head over and make a small donation to their cause. Again, it's very hard to run a nonprofit in today's world, and any help you can provide would be appreciated, I'm sure. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to support, please like, share, subscribe, follow, leave a review, send up a prayer, and or anything else required for the platform on which you're listening. Your support means more to me than you know, and I can always be reached at bloodandleather@gmail.com should you have any questions or comments. Again, I'm Tim Carter. Thanks for listening, and endeavor to persevere.